Any undergraduate class I teach, my goal is to enable students to be able to see the broader patterns of politics, patterns that are modern, but patterns that are also historical, because that's what's going to be important, not only for students who want to go on in politics, but for students who go on in law, who want to be a CEO of a company, and now their companies faced with a crisis that has, or a situation that has political components. And studying the presidency is, of course, perfect for that, because there's a lot we can learn from recent presidents and the historical trajectory of the presidency, new media, new political challenges. If you can distinguish what you can learn from the past with what's distinct about your challenges, I mean, you can lead a company, you can lead a major law firm, right? This is, I think, a skill that's both intellectual but real that students, I hope they'll go away from, or at least building that skill.
Welcome to the Civic Agora, a podcast from the Stanford Civics Initiative, where we discuss ideas on democracy and citizenship.
Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Civic Agora. I'm your host, Javier Mejia, and today I have the great pleasure of being with Brandice Canes-Wrone.
Thanks, Javier.
I'm very, very happy that you're here. Let me say that you are a professor in the political science department here at Stanford, and you're also the Maurice Greenberg Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And you're also the director of the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. We're going to be talking about that in a bit. And you're part of the faculty steering committee of the Stanford Civics Initiative. And again, I'm super, super happy of having you here. I think there are a bunch of things I want to ask you. But I would like to start with a question about your career and your life. You came back a few years ago to Stanford, and I say back because you did your PhD here.
I did.
I'm curious about that path, about coming back to the place where you initiated your career. But I'm also curious about your life before the PhD. What was the origin of your interest in political science and the American political system? How did you become the scholar that you are today?
Thanks so much. So I grew up in the DC area. So on the one hand, I always had just an interest in politics as an entity. But I didn't think of myself as necessarily majoring in politics or becoming a political scientist. It's sort of, in some ways, I thought about it the way some people might think about following literature or sports, or the arts, that it was fascinating. But I always liked the act of research. I was very fortunate it was a public high school, Langley High School, which still exists. And in those days, there were actual research projects that in certain classes you were assigned. And so my first publication was in history, right? And so did a project on a history of a house, using some local archives, and the winners of a contest, were, quote, published in the local library. But I was really hooked on the whole act of using primary evidence to learn about the world, in this case, about the history of a nearby town and a nearby part of that town. I won't do the academic act of now describing the whole project for an hour. I'll leave that for those who want to go seek it out. But then in college, I became increasingly interested in political science as an academic field of study, and both through classes and again, in my undergraduate years, which were at Princeton, I was fortunate to have a number of research opportunities. That's part of the kind of standard Bachelor of Arts curriculum at Princeton, and again, felt I was hooked. And so then it was just a question of what would I, if you like research in all these different areas, I'd done some in economics, I'd done some in political science, and I'd done some, again, as a high school student in history, it was just, what would this be in? And I realized that kind of excitement about thinking about politics in my off hours was really a good sign that this was really the type of thing I should focus on. You could actually make it a job. It didn't have to just be something you did for fun.
Okay, and also, so your PhD is in political economics. I guess is the one of the GSB. Why why not in just purely political science?
That's a great question. So I was, as an undergraduate, I was an economics major who did what's called at Princeton a certificate. You could think of it at most universities like a minor in political economy. And so a number of my courses were in political science. And I just realized that I had a strong interest in both fields, but that part of my interest in economics, for me, though it was the numbers and the kind of method, but that in terms of the questions I wanted to be answering, they were really about politics. And this program at Stanford afforded that opportunity to basically combine those interests. Now that opportunity would exist in most of the major, if not all of the major, political science departments. But back then, that was considered a more unusual type of program.
I see.
It's still unusual, but I mean, it was,
right,
but even more so back then. Yeah.
Right. Let me ask you about that then, about your thematic interest, right? So you eventually developed this expertise in American politics, and beyond like knowing what exactly drove you to that field, I would like to ask you about the particularities of the U.S. from a political point of view, right? And this is partly motivated by the fact that I'm an economist, but I did my PhD in economics. I kept that path for longer, I guess. Yes. And one of the first surprises that I had when I moved to a political science department was that there was a field, an entire field that was American.
I've seen other economists. Alberto Alsina writes that in one of his books. You wouldn't believe this. There's a whole field.
It's just about the years.
And at some point, I mean, I'm sure that there are like power dynamics behind this, but at the same time, the U.S. is very particular. Yes. How do you see that? What's the singularity of the U.S., if there's any at all?
Okay, so I'm going to answer both parts of your question, because I think answering this kind of the economist view of why do we even have this field is worth answering in a moment. But I will also note sort of what's just particular about the United States in general, which is, I think, slightly separate from the sociology of the political science field. In terms of the United States, in my mind, the United States, it's the first nation state that is explicitly a nation state of immigrants, and multicultural, diverse. Now, it's not the first multicultural, diverse society. So that's where I want to be very careful. And I'm sure historians will correct me that I'm missing other nation states of immigrants. I'm being prepared to be corrected on that. But it's a major experiment in this sense. It's going to be a democratic, I should have added, a democratic nation state. It's, so obviously there's places such as, what's now Istanbul, Constantinople, right? Massively multicultural, right? In its history. So I'm not even claiming we're the most multicultural, but that's not a nation state of a democracy, right? That's a very different, those societies had very different. And when we think of earlier democracies, we tend to think of them as being much less of, a diverse group coming in. And even the early United States is diverse for its time, right? And I think that's still an enormous strength of the United States. And you can see that our government then, leading to the government, is set up to make this work, right? So we're less singular now because some of the things we've done have been transported to other countries who want to achieve some of the similar ends. But we're set up with lots of checks and balances at the federal government, and then with enormous federalism that, again, you never really want to say unprecedented because someone's going to point to a country in the world that has more federalism than the United States. But it is unusual in the large degree of federalism that it has for one of the major democracies in the world. It has an exceptional degree combined with these checks and balances, which are designed to work through the large strength that we have in being a country of diversity, a country of immigrants, a country, where we don't have kind of a unifying 2,000-year, 5,000-year, cultural lineage that's pulling us together. What's pulling us together is this excitement of bringing these differences together.
Right. It's fascinating, and also, despite the fact that it's very evident, right? Like, it's part of the whole idea of what the U.S. is, but once you think about it, it's very special.
Can I answer the second part quickly? So I should note that sounds like I'm justifying the field of American politics. What I will say is there is an element of teaching in the United States that's relevant. So unlike in many countries, right, we do general undergraduate degrees, and law, for instance, is not an undergraduate degree. And certain other types of professional degrees that in other countries would be more standard as undergraduate degrees are masters here. So in American politics, we're doing a lot, in the U.S. So we're teaching courses in often law, public law, the courts. We're teaching classes across issues like the Congress and public administration, that people who would go into the government, and would go on in the United States maybe to do a master's of public policy or public administration. You could almost think, so American politics, and that's in addition to topics like public opinion, race, political psychology. So we're covering more than, we're not just teaching one class after another on kind of the same set of topics. And so I think it's partly due to the exceptionalism of the United States, but I think it is also largely due to the way the kind of American academy more broadly is organized, not simply in political science, but in terms of what's an undergraduate versus graduate degree.
So let me use that to ask you a bit about your role as a teacher, right? I'm particularly curious about one of the classes that you teach, that it's part of the Stanford Civics Initiative. That it's called the Presidency.
Yes.
Right. But if you can try to connect just what you mentioned with this, right? So what do you think is like your responsibility as an instructor, someone that is teaching these undergrads that are probably not that exposed to the familiarity with American institutions, and what do you think that you can achieve with your course? But maybe to begin with, tell me about the class, and then about your teaching spirit.
So any undergraduate class I teach, my goal is to enable students to be able to see the broader patterns of politics, patterns that are modern, but patterns that are also historical. And this is what's challenging about politics, I think, more, I hope you can disagree, but in some ways more similar to studying business than economics, if you will follow me for a moment, which is then to take individual cases and be able to assess what's similar to previous patterns and what's distinctive, so that you can analyze those cases in real time. Because that's what's going to be important, not only for students who want to go on in politics, but for students who go on in law, who want to be a CEO of a company, and now their companies faced with a crisis that has, or a situation that has political components. There's a lot you can learn from looking at and understanding the systematic context, but then you do have to be able to hone in on what's special. And studying the presidency is, of course, perfect for that, because there's a lot we can learn from recent presidents and the historical trajectory of the presidency. And yet things are always changing in politics, right? New media, new political challenges, and you have to be able, societal changes. And so you have to both be able, if you can distinguish what you can learn from the past with what's distinct about your challenges, I mean, you can lead a company, you can lead a major law firm, right? This is, I think, a skill that's both intellectual but real, that students, I hope they'll go away from, or at least building that skill.
Let me then ask you about that now, following the topic of your class. So what are those essential elements that have changed in the presidency as an institution, right?
Yes.
And the way in which I thought about asking you about this was, what would George Washington, if would be able to see what the presidency is today, would think about it, right? How different was it from his experience? Then I'm going to ask you about the figure specifically, but for the moment, I'm curious on the institution.
I like that question. That I have each week this year in my class, we have a discussion board where I give discussion questions ahead of time, and that was one of them. Where students could write in, may have used the word, what would most shock, and but maybe it would surprise. So a few things. One is just the power of the presidency, right? The president was not designed to be a particularly powerful figure. And so one of the things to think about, that we think about in our class, and that I think all citizens should think about, is what are the sources of that rise in executive power, and how much of that is due to the actions of presidents and of congressional members in the courts, and how much of that are due to societal changes that sort of encouraged these developments. A second thing that would shock people is kind of the role, and it's related to the president's power, but the role of the president as a prime figure in American society, right? The president was actually not seen as kind of this kind of superstar, right? That's been in existence for some time now. Obviously, it seems to keep ratcheting up beyond the point, we think it can't get higher, and it gets higher. In the 1800s, the president was simply not seen as kind of the most powerful individual in Washington, and they weren't a focal point. Now, we had a very different media environment, right? We had very different government and scale of government and relationship of the United States to other nations and role in the world. So, I mean, a lot has changed. But I'll point to those two things that would simply shock George Washington, in my view.
I've never thought about that. I mean, I guess again, it makes a lot of sense. I think I should audit your class. Certainly I should. And let me now ask you about that, about the figure of the president, because indeed, as you describe it, is probably today, when you think about a well-known figure in the world, there's probably no one that could be better known across the entire planet than a president of the U.S. And so I want to ask you about the figures that have been in that position. How has that changed over time? How different is Joe Biden or Donald Trump from the presidents in the late 18th century and the 19th century?
So there are a lot of differences in presidents over time, and then there are some similarities. I joke with my students, if you are searching for a title of an edited volume, continuity and change is always always a safe one, because in politics, there's a lot of continuity, and yet there's change. So. One of, you've sort of asked about kind of these differences. One of the interesting phenomena that you see as some continuity is presidents' sort of increased authority during wartime. So, for instance, right, Abraham Lincoln massively increases his authority and ability to jail opponents, to control the press. During wartime. What Lincoln does that's slightly different than future presidents, one could argue, certainly more strongly than future presidents, is Lincoln's very conscious of wanting the president not to have that authority as soon as the Civil War is over. So is consistently trying to undo the power and make sure that it doesn't extend beyond the war. In other cases, Congress has gone along with some of these efforts to afford more control to the executive branch in war, and Congress has taken it back, which is a little bit different. And over time, what you typically see is that these kind of international crises tend to aggrandize the president. And I'd say since World War II, it has not really gone back. If you think of the war on terror under Bush. Not a lot of rolling back, a little bit, but and it's Obama who comes in after Bush. This is not a partisan issue here. That presidents tend to want that authority in foreign affairs. So when you have a United States that is at the center, very much in the center of world politics, even when we're not in wartime, that sort of role of the United States in the world is going to grant the president a lot of authority. I mean, that's just one slice of the question, but
yeah, and I would like to connect that with, I guess, the broader evolution of the institutions in the U.S. And for that, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you came from history in your early days.
Deeply still like history a lot. Yeah.
And historians regularly debate about how important leaders are and big figures are.
Yes.
And I would like to hear from you about the role of specific presidents. How important have they been for the shape of the U.S. as the nation that it has become? And, well, I guess that naturally that's eventually going to tell us a bit about what the world has become. But as you described, there's a point in which the presidents become more powerful.
Yes.
And I guess the answer is going to be related to that. But I want to hear your take on this. Okay. Yeah.
Key presidents, though, it gets very hard, and it gets even harder in modern times because it's hard to fully assess, I think, with modern the most recent presidents, who's the most influential. But obviously, you'd have to, in terms of the most influential presidents, you'd have to first point to Washington for setting the tone, even though it was assumed that the office was almost created with the knowledge that he would be inhabiting it. There's a world in which he gets sick and dies, and somebody else is the first president, right? And it could have taken a very different tone. So he is very much against the sort of large presidential power model, not going to use it to aggrandize himself. And that has, at least in the context of the 17 and 1800s, a very large impact on the role as it develops. You have Lincoln, who's consequential, I would say, primarily for what he does for our country, but is actually wanting to be would love to be a more traditional president, but can't be, right? Under the circumstances. And so you could say he sets a model for how you could be, try to balance those two aims. And, he's just consequential for all the obvious reasons for what he does for our country. Someone who wouldn't show up on a lot of lists, but I want to just highlight is Teddy Roosevelt, right? He's not always seen as one of the most influential presidents. And I'll talk about his relative FDR in a moment, who's often pointed to as the first modern president. But Teddy Roosevelt actually looks much more like a modern president than his precedenters. The world does not look as modern. So but he starts to build on the railroad, the ability to travel the country more easily. He takes proposals to the public in a way that his predecessors had not been able to do. He also starts to enlarge the federal government's domain. Again, you could say in response to some of the concerns about monopoly, and so he becomes this trust-busting president. But he starts to look more modern. Sort of the federal government should be solving these problems, and not just the federal government, but me as president should be leading this charge from a bully pulpit and encouraging the voters to write, in this case, letters to their members to encourage them to do what I want to do. Now, that starts to me to look very modern, even though he doesn't have the radio, he doesn't have the communications technology, and he doesn't have the size of government, but he is pushing in that direction. And I think you could plump him down and he would feel very comfortable, settling in. He would not feel like Washington. He would not feel as shocked and perhaps horrified. I think he would say, this is great. So we get to his cousin, who really, or his relative, FDR, who starts to, is often called the first modern president. And what's clear is the executive branch looks very different. So, I mean, like Lincoln, he takes us through this, enormous trial, maybe not as large as the Civil War, but certainly the world would look very different, without if World War II had gone in a different direction. And he takes us through the Depression. So all of that. But what he does is he also massively enlarges the executive branch. So when you look at these charts of what does the executive branch look like pre-FDR and post-FDR, it's just not even remotely comparable. And it does not go down. This is not a wartime and then scale back. It looks like the executive branch does today for the most part. And a lot of that power is vested in the president in one way or another, in the White House, in predecessors of, say, the Office of Management and Budget, which under FDR were called the Bureau of the Budget. So he's, I'd say, individually a very significant president. We can always debate, if wouldn't someone have done what Teddy wrote, wouldn't someone have done what FDR had done? It's harder to argue that, I think, with Washington and Lincoln. You can certainly see worlds where people would not have done. But you can certainly see where they accelerated processes and where the government could have looked very different. You could grow the government. You didn't have to grow it the way and to the magnitude that FDR did. And the last president, since you kind of seemed to ask for examples, I'll mention is Reagan. I think for me, Reagan is still so recent that I don't want to kind of have that recency. But I think to me, what Reagan does is he brings in a model that future Republican executives look to, which is how would you try to balance being a president in this environment if you believe that the federal government should not be as large, yet you're not kind of living in the 1800s, right? And so Reagan is both leading a very modern Defense Department. He's curbing some government spending, but on the domestic side, a little less than the rhetoric, suggests, but certainly curbs the growth, right? And does reduce taxes, works with the Democrats. It's the most recent immigration reform we've had is under Reagan. So he's very much a modern president. He's not trying to be Andrew Jackson or, Polk or, any of these 1800 figures. And he's doing it, though, in a more conservative model. And in that sense, I think you can say, well, is that really consequential? But I think that is consequential because we have two parties, and this is the model that most future Republican presidents and candidates have looked to.
This is a fascinating conversation. I want to ask you 100 questions more on this, but I would like to use the last 5 minutes that we have to know more about the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. And tell me what it is, but also help me to think about why do we need to revitalize American institutions? At what point they have suffered so much that we need to revitalize them? Tell me about what's the origin of this endeavor and what do you think we should do about it?
So, the center really started, and Condoleezza Rice deserves credit for envisioning the center. And so I've come in after the center had been envisioned and where I'm the first faculty director of it. Trust has declined in the U.S. and trust in government and trust in a variety of governmental institutions for decades. So this is not a recent phenomena. This is not simply a kind of post-Trump phenomena. It's been declining from both parties. And at some point, I would argue it starts to compromise the mission of the government. We obviously don't want blind trust in our government. Governments make mistakes. Governments, are composed of lots of individuals who are fallible. And we want accountability, but blind distrust is also not a positive, is almost equally or more, one might argue, damaging. And we've gotten to a point where across a variety of American institutions, both our government, but also educational institutions, the media, a lot of these institutions that really found are the foundation of a democratic society are also not trusted. And so at that point, the kind of fraying of society, you start to see this fraying of society. And so then the question is, what can we do? And what can we do at the Center for Revitalizing Institutions, which we call RAI, and what can we do more broadly as a society? So we're hoping to do 3 types of things, recognizing with some humility that this is a big problem, and we're going to need a lot of partners and help to make inroads. One is we're going to produce great research that addresses the root causes of these problems and that both provides new solutions and evaluates existing proposals for reform. Second, we're going to try to get our work in front of policymakers and the attentive public and move from pure research, which as a scholar, I do think is very important. And I think that some ideas are out there for 6 months from now, and some ideas are out there for 30 years from now, and that we're trying to produce great ideas that are ready for both timeframes. But for those that could work in 6 months in advance, we want to be getting the attention, both of those that make the policy decisions, but also those that are going to influence. So I guess maybe you can see why I have some admiration for Teddy Roosevelt. I don't think I'll be on trains across the country, but we need to get our word out there when we have solutions that we think would help. And third, we're getting involved in the civic education space. And so one of the causes of some of the problems, not the only cause, is that civics education has simply declined in the United States. And we see this both in terms of the knowledge of young people and of adults, and also simply what's being covered in schools. It's been an area that's been hit hard. So we're trying, and that encompasses, so obviously Stanford Civics Initiative is near and dear to my heart. In that way, we think that this is both a problem in the college level. It's also a problem in the K through 12 level. We know happily we're not alone in being concerned about this problem. And so we're working on finding the best ways that we can contribute uniquely, where we're not simply mimicking others' efforts. And and some of those areas relate to ways in which Josh Ober and the Stanford Civics Initiative and your work, Javier, and others at the Stanford Civics Initiative, which is both, there's this curricular part, and then there's also this part about how do we have civil discourse about difficult political issues on which we hold different opinions. And so, which is, a tough problem, but one we deal with every day at universities. And so one in which we should hopefully have something to contribute and say about.
It is, it's a huge responsibility. And I want to thank you for daring to lead like this difficult but important endeavor. And we don't have more time, but this was great. I think that we need to have another conversation of this. I want to ask you more about Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
I don't even know if you know, but in Latin America, probably he's one of the most popular presidents of the U.S.
Okay.
In some places, probably not seen so sympathetically as maybe you say. But certainly influential, right?
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Yes.
Let me thank you again.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much, Javier.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Civic Agora, brought to you by the Stanford Civics Initiative. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify, where you can discover more podcast episodes and gain access to additional information about the Stanford Civics Initiative. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.